Hi, I'm Jim Rutledge, Master Distiller of Four Roses Bourbon, and it's great to be here in Farragut, Tennessee, and at Farragut Wine Spirits for our bourbon tasting tonight, and looking forward to the event. Appreciate being here. Sure, we actually date back to the 1860s. We got our start in Atlanta, Georgia, when a father and son after the Civil War, Paul Jones Sr. and Paul Jones Jr., had opened a small grocery store and small distribution warehouse. And during this time, Paul Jr. was courting a young lady in Atlanta, and he also was about to purchase a small distillery that had just begun making a corn whiskey near Atlanta. And after a period of his courtship, he decided to ask for her hand in marriage. And they agreed the evening of an upcoming grand ball that they were to attend, that if she were to accept his proposal of marriage, that she would signify so that evening by wearing a corsage of 4 red roses on her gown. And if her answer were no, she would wear 3 roses. She wore the 4 roses, and in honor of the occasion, the love and the passion, he named the whiskey he was making Four Roses Bourbon. Or Four Roses, it wasn't yet bourbon. In 1884, Georgia was one of the first states in the U.S. to enact a statewide prohibition, and anyone working in the beverage alcohol business in any capacity had to leave the state or change professions. Paul Sr. had died, and Paul Jones Jr. moved his company, the Paul Jones Company, to Kentucky, opened his first office on Main Street in Louisville, Kentucky, which is now a historic district in Louisville, a number of buildings for a 2-block area named Whiskey Row. We have the documentation of when he moved to Kentucky, his first office, when he moved from that office to another one. And in 1888, Paul Jr. trademarked the name Four Roses. Continued to grow the brand, and Paul Jr. passed away in 1895, and the operation of the Paul Jones Company was turned over to one of his nephews, Lawrence Jones. Continued growing the company, and when Prohibition was enacted on January 16, 1919, there were 6 bourbon distilleries that had been permitted by the U.S. government to continue selling bourbon, not producing bourbon, but selling based on their existing barrel inventories for medicinal purpose. One of those 6 distilleries was the Frankfurt Distilling Company, and the Paul Jones Company purchased the Frankfurt Distilling Company, and in that manner, Four Roses was continued to be sold throughout the Prohibition era of 13 years, and even during those 13 years, the people that were sick enough were allowed to buy per prescription. The prescriptions were issued to doctors by the U.S. government, serial numbered like a dollar bill. And a person that was sick enough could purchase 1 bottle, and all bottle sizes were in the pint size. Purchase 1 pint every 10 days, and it was a cure, I suppose, to all illnesses. And I think it's well documented there were more sick people during those 13 years than in any time in our history prior to Prohibition and subsequent to Prohibition. When Prohibition was repealed on December 5th, 1933, Four Roses Bourbon quickly became the #1 selling bourbon in the U.S. and stayed that way through the 30s, through the 40s, and most of the 50s. And I think most important was the fact that it was the most recognized name in all distilled spirits, despite the fact that Seagram was a giant in the industry, because Seagram had been putting away Canadian whiskeys for more than 6 years when Prohibition was repealed, and they had the barrel inventory to flood the U.S. with whiskeys when no other distillery had an inventory of whiskey. They became the overnight giant, yet Four Roses was the most recognized name in the business, and for that reason, the Seagram Company purchased the entire Frankfurt Distilling Company in 1943, primarily to get the Four Roses Bourbon name. And Seagram wanted the Four Roses Bourbon name, and it was in 1945 that Seagram, which was a blended whiskey company, and Seagram's founder, Sam Brofman, was a champion of blended whiskeys. Seagram introduced a new blended whiskey to add to their vast portfolio of brands and named it Four Roses Premium. Instead of bourbon under our crest of our logo of Four Roses, it said Premium, and where our bourbon is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey under premium and said a blend of 100% American whiskeys. That brand continued to grow through the 40s and 50s, and by the mid to late 50s it was selling more than 250,000 cases in the U.S. Our bourbon had reached this peak of performance and sales in the mid to late 50s at near 1.3 million cases. And at the end of the 50s, Sam Bronfman made a decision to focus domestically on the blended whiskeys and pulled the number one selling bourbon off the U.S. market. Four Roses bourbon disappeared from the U.S. by 1960. Now, Seagram kept 4 other bourbons that they had in their inventory, but none were as well known as the Four Roses brand, of course. And the primary reason people are always asking, how could a company sell or remove from the market the number one selling brand, the money, the power, and the ego to want all the top shelf brands to be associated with Seagram, having the Seagram names on it. And Four Roses bourbon was removed from the market for that reason, because it was so well recognized. And then from that point on, Seagram focused on their blended whiskeys. From 1960 up until the time we came back to the U.S., we had become immediately after going into international brands, international markets, we became the number one selling brand and are today in many or most European countries, Western European countries and Southern European countries. We're the number one selling bourbon in Japan, yet unfortunately the people that remember the Four Roses name, unfortunately after being off the market for more than 40 years, remember the blended whiskey, which was a good blended whiskey when it was introduced by Seagram. But Seagram had a history of building a brand to reach where the marketing research team felt like it reached the peak of performance without adding a lot of money to achieve very little results. Seagram would pull 100% of the support from the brand and let it die away based on the name it had earned during its peak of performance. That happened in the early 60s. When it happened, the Four Roses blended whiskey became a spirit blend versus a 100% whiskey brand, and it became a cheap, inexpensive, bottom shelf blended whiskey, which totally destroyed the renowned name that the Four Roses bourbon once had in the industry. I'd had an ongoing debate for years with Seagram marketing personnel, trying to encourage them to just make the blended whiskey disappear from their brands, let us bring our bourbon back home. And unfortunately, it took Seagram going out of the beverage alcohol business in December 2001 for us to come back to the U.S. The first decision we made was that we would reintroduce Four Roses bourbon to the U.S. And in mid-2002, we hired an agency to go around the country, and we recalled every bottle of blended whiskey we could find and destroyed it, making plans to introduce our bourbon. We knew we couldn't focus on our Yellow Label, which is the number one selling brand in Europe, much of Europe and Japan, because of the negative image and the perception that we were once again bringing out the blended whiskey. So we introduced our single barrel bourbon in September 2004, and we decided we would focus on our premium bourbon brands and not put any money behind our Yellow Label, and hoping that people would begin to realize, hey, the Yellow Label is a bourbon, not the blended whiskey, and the sales would turn around on it also, which has happened over the years. Yellow Label is our fastest growing brand. We introduced our single barrel again in September 2004. Back then, Whiskey Magazine, the largest, I think the largest trade magazine in the world, that's out of London, was conducting their best of the best whiskeys of the world competition, with categories like Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskeys, and all types of American whiskeys, including straight rye whiskeys, Canadian blended whiskeys, all American whiskeys. And it was a 2-year process. In place, they would hold competitions in places like Tokyo, London, Paris, Glasgow, and we decided to enter the contest with our single barrel. Even though it was very late in the competition, we felt like we didn't have an opportunity to win anything, but if we had some writers that were on some of the tasting panels and they're all blind taste tests. And at the end of the day, when the people that were judging the whiskeys would find out the brands that they had judged, and if some people had like sample number 5 out of 10 in front of them and it turned out to be Four Roses single barrel, they would write about it. That would help jumpstart our return to the U.S. That's what we did. It took us 2 years to become the #1 selling single barrel in Kentucky, and when we came back to the U.S., we only had the barrel inventory to go into one market. We chose Kentucky a little for the reasons it's our home. The major reason is that it's the most competitive bourbon market in the world. We wanted to see how we would stand up against the now well-established brands. So I think in 2 years, by our single barrel becoming the #1 selling single barrel in Kentucky, we felt like we were on our way. We were building our barrel inventories, and in September 2006, we introduced our small batch bourbon to fill the gap between our yellow label and our single barrel. We distill and age 10 recipes. We use 4 of them for small batch. We wanted to begin to let consumers know the difference in Four Roses with the multiple recipes that we use for our bourbon, and that's why we wanted the small batch, focusing on 4 recipes. Our yellow label uses all 10. Single barrel, of course, is 1 recipe. Last year, 2011, our sales in the U.S. were up 42% over 2010, and the first 7 months of this year versus an equivalent period last year in 2011, we're up 59%. So we're on our way. We're in 47 states now. We're not in Alaska. We're about ready to go in Alaska. We're getting close to going into Hawaii, not there yet, and hopefully we'll soon be in New Mexico. That's the only 3 states we're not in as of right now. There's a couple of things. I mentioned our 10 recipes that we distill and age. We have use 2 grain recipes, mash bills. We use a lot of small flavoring grain, a lot more than any other bourbon brand. We have one mash bill that has 75% corn, 25% rye grain, and 5% malted barley. The other has 60% corn, 35% rye, and 5% malted barley. Even the 20% rye mash bill is more than small flavoring grain than any other. We use, this gives Four Roses a little bit of spiciness relative to other brands. And the smoothness and the mellowness of Four Roses, I think, sets us apart. And to achieve something really good at the end, to be the best of the best, in our opinion, I'm touch prejudiced, at the end of the process, what goes into the bottle, it's imperative to begin with the best raw materials. This is our 52nd year of using the same group of farmers, a small group in a small geographic area in Indiana. We've sourced our corn now for 52 years from the same families of farmers. We've used more rye than anyone else. We look at every rye market grown around the world. We've been sourcing our rye grain from Germany about 8 of the last 10 years. 5 years prior to that, 4 of those years, we sourced our rye out of Sweden, which I thought was probably the best rye I've ever seen in my career. So starting off with the best of the grains enables us to achieve the smoothness and mellowness, a nice soft long finish without the kick and bite as most bourbons. And it doesn't make us better. I'm not going to say that. It just makes us a little bit different, and people can anticipate the flavors are different. Now that's the smoothness and mellowness, and also every label, because of our 10 recipes, there is an infinite number of ways that we can mix or mingle or blend those recipes together to get something new each and every time. Every label consumers will ever see with a Four Roses label on the bottle will be different by formula design, not just because it has more or less age or more or less strength or age in one warehouse versus another. It actually are totally different by a formula design. For example, our single barrel bourbon relative to our small batch bourbon, we use 4 recipes here. We use 1 here. The yeast we use in our single barrel is not one of 2 yeasts we use in our small batch. And one thing I didn't say earlier, we use the 2 mash bills, And I don't know of another distillery anywhere. Now, there could be some of the micro distilleries that are doing something different, but I don't know of another distillery of any kind of whiskey that is using more than one proprietary yeast culture, and we have 5. So it's in conjunction with the 2 mash bills, using 5 yeast at different times in fermentation, is how we distill and age separately, 10 recipes. Well, I've sat on a lot of, like the Whiskey Magazine panels. I've been in London and Paris and Tokyo and here in the U.S. on the panels, whether it be on a panel like that or in our own lab looking at distillates or aged whiskeys. I always look at samples if I'm like on a Whiskey Magazine panel. Samples, blind samples are poured in front of me. I always look at the color. That tells me a little bit about the age and or the strength. I smell the samples, take a very small taste, because I will always swallow, because I think the finish is so important. Then I'll add a little water, just a dash of water to the sample, go through the same process again, because the water will open up the flavors. And look for the nose. You want a nice pleasant aroma, the taste, a nice mouthfeel. And I will swallow the samples, because you can smell great, taste great, but if it doesn't finish smooth and mellow, to me that's one of the major criteria, and that's one of the things we always look for in Four Roses bourbon.